Great. One thing that is important to add is that the concept of science itself has changed throughout the ages. And I think that for a long time, science just meant knowledge, or the episteme, in the old sense. But now, in the English-speaking world, it counts for natural science. Whereas, for instance, some people have said that that the notion of science in, let's say, German, it involves both the humanities and the natural sciences, whereas in English-speaking world, the notion of science frequently is used and reserved for natural science as opposed to the humanities.
Well, if you've touched on a sore spot here,
Okay.
as a psychologist here, well, to be fair, psychology is an extension of biology, really, at least as I conceive of it. There are the social sciences which don't actually use methods that I consider that stringently empirical, but there's a sort of spectrum of what to consider as science, because you could argue, there's a discipline known as political science, but really the study of politics, is that really what we mean by science? Like it's more talking about the methodology, like they use numbers and they try and test hypotheses about how certain things work. So they are applying the methods, but also the reality of the situation is that the level of sophistication of the methodology, and it's not a case of, less sophisticated is good. Normally I would err on that as a general philosophy, but when it comes to things like data analysis, the more sophistication, the more competent you are at doing it, the less likely you are to be misled by the data that you have. And so it's more about your capability to understand the data that you have collected, because there are lots and lots of different things. Like when I did my master's dissertation for behavioral decision making, which is, behavioral economics in psychology, which is a cognitive psychological field, and therefore more on the, it's more sort of biologically informed than, say, social psychology, which, you could argue isn't as legitimate as an aspect of science as some other things. But with that, when I did the statistical testing of my data, I ran about 8 different tests to test whether my data was susceptible for analysis in the first place. So you run all of these different tests to see whether your data is biased in any way or might be misleading. This is a very general thing, like the actual mathematics of it, like you're testing for all sorts of weird things like sphericity and terms that people have never heard of before, and you're looking at graphs that look strange, and it's quite a procedure to learn it all.
Okay.
And the way I conceive of science more generally is a sort of hierarchy of practice.
So it's more about the method as opposed to the content of what is being said.
Yes.
And studied. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You could say it's a sort of due process.
It's a due process for truth, yeah.
Yeah.
In a way that courts can never be. There you go. I've got to inject a little bit of political stuff in there. But
the reason I say this is because one of the main distinctions that people need to bear in mind when we're talking about thinking is a distinction between truth and justification.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the times, justification and truth are not come apart.
Mm-hmm.
We may have all sorts of beliefs that may be justified, but ultimately false.
Mm.
So it seems to me that science is the scientific method is mostly focused on the justification aspect of it. Mm-hmm. Of course, truth is what is the goal.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that there is a sort of focus on the procedure in science. And why am I saying this? It seems to me that, in fact, it's much more prevalent than the other bit, because a lot of the time scientists and people who talk about the researchers, they say that I will assume some things, I will make these assumptions, and I will try to see what follows from these assumptions, and I will try to interpret the data I have access to and I subject to test through the prism of these assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't seem to me to be an issue so much of saying that these assumptions are infallibly true, and we never question them. There is, in fact, intense scrutiny of these assumptions. But the focus is on much more on the procedural aspect of it, I think.
Yeah, and I think that from the outside, people presume, well, when they hear that all research rests on assumptions, and that to some might delegitimize its work, but the point is that they don't necessarily take anything for granted, and it's only when you use a plethora of different methodologies and you start getting the same thing with different presumptions, do you start saying, okay, well, maybe we're onto something here. And, it's only in the sort of meta-analyses sort of stages where you start refining things down when you're carrying out sort of cutting-edge research.
Yeah.
Like my research, no one had carried out the experiment I had designed before, ever. So, I had to come up with something novel. I had a lot of presumptions, but that's the only way you can operate. But you just need to have the sort of research methodology chops to be able to identify, okay, here are my assumptions, here's what I'm bringing to the table. Sometimes, because you're a human being and it's very difficult to spot all of your assumptions, you might miss one or two, right? But that's what peer review is for, to pick up the slack. And so you mitigate for them. You design the experiment around controlling as much as possible for these assumptions. But you still have to make sort of informed guesses. You can use research to kind of shape which assumptions you are making in designing your experiment. And you can also do multiple different sort of experiments within a single study to test whether your assumptions are biasing the results in any way. So you can change the methodology, and this happens quite a lot, where a lot of published papers will run a study one way and then they'll do it a slightly different way, and then they'll do it another way, following up from analysing the data of the first two, and then there'll be a follow-up on that, which is looking at a different aspect of it and adding in some sort of extraneous variables and things like that. That's the sort of blueprint that I have in my mind of how these sorts of things work. And normally that's pretty powerful, because by that point, if you've got one study that's got multiple different experiments that's testing various assumptions, and you've got a reasonably large sample by that point, because you've probably sampled, I don't know, just a sort of best guess, sort of a psychology style paper would maybe have, I don't know, 120 to 150-ish per condition, which is the sort of territory where you start to eliminate the probability that the results are a product of chance. You can do a bunch of mathematical calculations, which I've done ad nauseum, to figure out the probability that your data set is a product of chance, rather than the trends in your data set, should I say, not just the data set itself, because it's a product of the world. Yeah, it's not a product of chance.
Let me just restate something I said before, because I think that it may lead to some misrepresentation of what I'm going to say afterwards. So I think it's important, what I said before about truth and justification. Obviously, a scientist cares for truth. And
not all of them, to be fair.
Not all of them.
As in, there's a healthy amount of self-interest and pride, and there are people who get stuck in their research paradigm.
Well, let us say that I have a very idealized notion of what a scientist is as a scientist, not necessarily as a businessman.
The epitome of a scientist.
Okay, so no, let us say that someone who cares about the science cares about the truth. It's not...
Sure.
It is almost the approach of science as having an intrinsic worth. Because, for instance, a lot of the times, some people think that a particular research is only valuable if it solves another problem or if it can be used for practical applications. But a lot of scientists, for instance, and in every theoretical discipline, not just, let's say, natural science, a lot of the times you see practitioners saying that this issue has intrinsic interest for me. Mm-hmm. Maybe people who may be interested in giving me a grant or something won't see it this way, and they will demand of some practical applications, or for me to present my research as being a bit more practically oriented and stuff. But there is a kind of intrinsic care about interest about the issue.
I think I agree with the sentiment that you're expressing here, but I would characterize it slightly differently.
Okay.
In that the science aspect is the methodology. That's like the tool. It's like saying the builder only cares about his tools rather than the building that he's built. Like the ends is the thing that you're finding out in is the exciting part. You're passionate about the actual subject matter. So when I was researching decision making, I wasn't enamored with the methodology, and in fact it was quite torturous because of the nature of the experiment I designed. It was very difficult to analyze, and I had to do a bunch of equations that were like A4 page long to do it, and so the actual science part of it, the methodology, was a bit of a chore. But what I could find out from going through that is the exciting part, which is very pedantic of me to sort of delineate. But that's what science is all about, is being very pedantic about minuscule details.
The same applies to philosophy.
I know,
Yeah. But what I want to say, though, before is that it seems to me that a lot of the time an issue with us, not an issue, a feature of people who are interested with science is the questioning mentality, and the mentality that is a bit sort of skeptical of certainties or alleged certainties. And the reason why I draw the distinction between truth and justification and come back to it again and again is because it seems to me that a lot of the times, not always, unfortunately I think there are some bad cases, but a lot of the times I think that there's a healthy element of humility in natural science and in conducting experiments because by the meticulous procedure of becoming clear about your assumptions, about the data you subject to scrutiny, and about your experiments and all these bits, you're sort of saying, well, these are all you're sort of making it easy for someone to see where things went wrong, if something goes wrong. So there's an element of trying to be a member of a community of thinkers, in which case you may add something, but if you add something, it's not necessarily in the way that you solve the greatest equation. You can show where something is wrong.
Well, there's a presumption of human fallibility that's integral to all scientific work.
Yeah.
In that, even the best intentioned person who's the brightest mind in their field can make methodological mistakes or bring presumptions to the table that will negatively affect the results and what inferences you can draw from them. And this humility is essential.
Yeah.
Like when I've published research, I kind of almost over-egg it a bit. I almost err too much on the side of caution, which I think is better than the inverse, in that I try not to read too much into data, because particularly to kind of articulate it from the inside view, I spent about 500 hours doing my master's dissertation, and that's a lot of time to invest in something. At the end of it, you want to feel like it's contributed something. You want to feel like I did some good work here. You don't want to think, oh, maybe it's all, basically a load of rubbish.
Yeah.
Which is a bit flippant, but, it's a very difficult thing because you become emotionally invested. There's a sort of sunk cost fallacy involved in there where you want to believe the data but you know that you shouldn't necessarily just accept it at face value, because that's dangerous. That can make you sort of delusional and think that you're perfect as a methodologist and you've not made any mistakes. And so there's a great effort that at least was put on scientific education when I was taught, to teach that humility, which is no easy thing to teach, but I think it was something that was sprinkled throughout, and there had already been the replicability crisis in the sciences, and that was a theme throughout a lot of my lectures. And they were talking about all of these mistakes and how our understandings evolve throughout time. And I think that's very important, because looking at the human understanding of ourselves basically over time is very interesting, because we've held lots of different false presumptions about the nature of our own thought before, and things like that. And when you look at it over a sort of span of history, say you're looking at 100 years of scientific research in a specific field, then you realize, wow, we've come a long way. And if you follow along with it chronologically, there's also this element of you start to feel invested in the theories that you're reading about. And this is something I found with philosophy as well. There's a sort of sunk cost fallacy going on there, whereby the more you read something, the more you believe it, even if what you're reading is no more or less true. It's just that you've spent a lot of time, there's an emotional attachment there, which you want to avoid. Because if you start getting emotionally attached, that's when you get into the realm, start, unintentionally developing yourself some pseudoscience.
Yeah.
And the main problem here is that you can start getting these attachments when you're going through the history of, say, a specific discipline, and you think, oh, this seems true. Like I'll get to like the 1970s in some sort of cognitive psychological field, and I'll be like, well, that seems like a perfectly reasonable common sense explanation for that phenomena. And then you get on to like 2006, and it'll be like, oh yeah, this experiment basically came up with results that you couldn't possibly get if this was true. So it's like a sort of irrefutable refutation, and then you're like, oh wow, that really shook my belief in my
and your
judgment.
Particular theory, yeah.
Yeah, and that's just when you're being taught it. It's not even by the time you're actually a practitioner. And so there's something quite interesting about that. I think that the way it's taught now almost makes you experience the mistakes that researchers of the past would have made, by getting you invested in the narrative of the progression of science. And because it does that, it kind of is like a meta-narrative of the plight that you as an individual researcher, when it becomes that time to do so, are going to go through.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.